Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Disclosure Project. Tonight we turn not to desert runways or mountain skies, but to the docks of 1943. A Navy destroyer rests quietly in the harbour, steel steady against the water, until the air around it blooms into a strange green haze. Moments later the ship is gone. When it reappears hundreds of miles away, the whispers grow darker. Sailors welded into bulkheads, voices echoing from inside the walls. If even part of that story is true, we're not just talking about invisibility, we're talking about the breaking of physics itself, and perhaps the glimpse of a future humanity was never meant to survive. For decades, this story has lived on the edge of war history and science fiction, whispered in bars and buried in declassified pages. Tonight, we'll step into that uneasy space. Together we'll trace how one ship's supposed disappearance grew into a legend of forbidden technology, and then ask the harder question, what if it was true? How does a rumour about one disappearing ship manage to survive decades, passed along like a story too strange to die? To answer that, we need to leave the docks and step into the strange, messy world of one man whose imagination or memory, depending on who you ask, sparked a conspiracy that still refuses to fade. His name was Carl Meredith Allen, though he also went by Carlos Allende when it suited him, and it's through his letters that the entire Philadelphia experiment first took shape. Imagine stacks of handwritten notes arriving out of nowhere, unrequested, stuffed with warnings about a dangerous experiment, and mailed to Morris Jessup, an already eccentric writer who had published a book on UFOs. That connection, more than anything, gave the story its bloodstream, moving it from tavern talk and half-heard whispers into published pages and, eventually, into a cultural myth. Allen himself was an enigma. People who saw his correspondence described his writing style as uneven, almost frantic, jumping between scientific-sounding jargon and cryptic asides. And then there was the handwriting. Some pages looked shaken, some seemed carefully scripted, and there were notes where words trailed off mid-thought, as if he struggled to catch up with his own urgency. He used different names depending on the letter, sometimes presenting himself as a distant observer, other times sounding like a man desperate to be heard. What made things worse, at least for anyone chasing the facts, is that Allen could never keep his story straight about whether he believed it himself. At one moment he insisted his account of a vanishing Navy ship was real eyewitness history. In another admission years later, he claimed he had embroidered details or outright made things up. The contradiction didn't weaken the legend, it hardened it. When someone refuses to be pinned down, suspicion itself becomes the glue. This leads us to the strangest artifact in this entire saga, an annotated copy of Jessup's UFO book, sometimes referred to as the VARRO edition. Picture a mundane mass-market paperback, but inside every margin cramped with scribbles like colour-coded graffiti. 3 different voices seem to be carrying on a conversation in ink, all claiming otherworldly knowledge. The notes spoke of advanced technology, shadow projects, and a hidden history of science beyond the public eye. Later, investigative curiosity traced these annotations back to Allen himself, playing different parts in his own drama. It looked less like a conversation among cosmic beings, and more like one man's attempt to build a mythology through fragmented dialogue. And yet this messy artifact became a kind of gravel root for the myth, feeding future writers and researchers eager to connect any scrap to the Philadelphia experiment. It's important to remember the cultural atmosphere in which all this happened. The 1950s were not just post-war, they were also a period of heightened paranoia. Newspapers brimmed with UFO sightings. The space race had not yet begun in earnest, but aerial fears haunted people. Alien-focused films filled theatres with images of invasion, and government secrecy around nuclear weapons made everything feel poisoned by suspicion. Into this fever dream came Allen's warnings that a US ship had bent reality itself, with devastating consequences. Jessup's book was already speaking to a readership primed for cosmic answers, so when the letters surfaced, they didn't feel entirely out of place. Instead, they seemed like confirmation that maybe the government knew more than it let on. A legend doesn't spread in a vacuum. It needs fertile ground, and mid-20th century America had soil rich with paranoia. Now here's the twist that kept the story alive. Allen's letters didn't just sit in Jessup's personal files, they circulated. Copies were quietly reproduced and bounced between institutions, and this is where a seed of real mystery took root. Why would a Navy-connected body show interest in keeping Allen's annotated version of a UFO book? If it was nonsense, if it was only the ramblings of an imaginative drifter, why preserve it in typewritten pages rather than throwing it in the trash? The formal existence of that so-called VARRO edition gave conspiracy believers exactly what they needed. A breadcrumb trail inside the halls of power. Nothing hands fuel to a rumour faster than official handling of unofficial claims. So you see, the Philadelphia experiment legend doesn't begin with a ship at all. It begins with letters, messy handwriting, strange pseudonyms, and a man who could not or would not give a straight answer. From there, the rumour took on a life of its own, amplified by a cultural moment already vibrating with suspicion about UFOs, hidden weapons projects, and technological breakthroughs leaking just far enough to scare the public without ever being explained. Allen, in many ways, acted less like a witness to an event than like a storyteller who stumbled into myth-making. With just enough contradiction to spark obsession, and just enough official attention to keep believers hanging on, the story no longer needed him to survive. Once the Philadelphia experiment entered the bloodstream of Cold War folklore, it kept beating on its own. Think of how many legends start with a single unreliable narrator. A lone man scrawling ragged notes can ignite decades of speculation when the cultural climate is right. That's exactly what happened here. Allen's eccentric habit of blending pseudoscience with half-confession made him unreliable, yes, but also perfect for myth. Later generations could project onto him whatever truth or deceit they preferred. Was he simply a crank desperate for attention, or was he a whistleblower who backtracked to avoid danger? Conspiracies thrive in that gap between certainty and denial. If we return to the opening question, how does a rumour about a disappearing ship survive decades? The answer here is clear. It survives because it doesn't need consistency. It needs suspicion, timing, and the faintest shadow of official recognition. Allen provided all three by throwing his own handwriting into the middle of an already anxious decade. Whether he lied, told the truth, or split the difference, the outcome was the same: a conspiracy myth born of scribbled marginalia, Cold War tension, and a public always eager for the one story that confirms their darkest suspicions. And yet, letters alone can't explain what kind of technology was supposedly in play. Words may start a legend, but for the story to endure, listeners needed something more concrete than mysterious notes and blurred handwriting. They needed wires humming with electricity, metal coils sparking into the night, and a visible ship that supposedly warped out of reality. Which brings us to the next layer of this legend: what the Navy was actually doing, and how ordinary wartime science could be mistaken for something far more extraordinary. Was the Navy chasing invisibility, or just trying to stop its ships from exploding under mines? That's the puzzle at the centre of what was officially called Project Rainbow, at least in the fragments we even hear about it. The name alone sounds like secret science fiction, but here's the reality of World War II. The oceans were seeded with German magnetic mines, hidden killers triggered by the very steel hulls meant to keep sailors safe. Ordinary navigation could turn fatal because the magnetised hull of a destroyer dragged across the sea like an unseen flare. And so, engineers had an urgent practical problem: strip away that magnetic signature before it became a death sentence. The solution they came up with wasn't magic cloaking, it was degaussing. Wrap a heavy steel vessel in coiled wires, pump through it thousands of amps of current, and bleed away the magnetic field until mines no longer recognise the ship as prey. It was physics applied at a wartime scale, loud, humming and blunt, but far from metaphysics. Imagine walking along a naval yard in 1943 and seeing a cable-fed coil nearly encircle the hull of a ship. Thick black wires carried pulses of electricity so strong they needed specialised equipment just to handle the current. During the procedure, the vessel's magnetic field was neutralised by pouring electricity through those coils in patterns calculated to oppose the stored magnetism of its steel plating. It worked. Fleets lived or died on the reliability of this practice. Once you finished the process, a mine calibrated to the magnetic mass of a full destroyer wouldn't even twitch. In wartime, this kind of invisible safeguard meant survival. But now imagine seeing this science not from a naval engineer's perspective, but from an untrained sailor, or worse, a passerby who only caught glimpses and rumours. Heavy machinery buzzes, faint shimmers of static in the air tickle your skin. The ship seems oddly veiled in a glow when the coils heat up under load. That technological procedure, viewed through superstition and stress, becomes fertile ground for a story far stranger than engineering. The glow itself was real but prosaic. High current and thick coils often produced corona discharges, visible blue-green hazes dancing across metal edges under strong voltage. Anyone who's seen an electrical storm halo knows this glow, but a frightened onlooker in 1943 might see it as something unnatural. Wires vibrate, a faint smell of ozone rises, surfaces shimmer. To technical staff, this was simply side effect. A hum, a glow, and a shift in the compass needle as fields fluctuated. To those who didn't understand why, it was sorcery. And so, a straightforward defensive measure against mines began its journey into whispered talk of ships that could vanish. Science hadn't leapt into another dimension. It had dipped into public misunderstanding. The Navy was guarding hulls from hidden bombs, not moving them through space. Yet the visual drama of the process gave birth to an illusion far larger than its intention. But here is where things turn slippery. It's easy to dismiss sailors' stories as exaggeration, yet there's a curious consistency. Accounts, whether garbled years later in bars or scribbled in Allen's letters, describe glowing auras and ships becoming hard to see against the horizon. Was this a misremembered viewing of a degaussing procedure? Maybe. But the problem is that real testimony doesn't collapse neatly into one explanation. Some insisted the Eldridge didn't just shimmer, but disappeared outright, later appearing at another naval base. That leap cannot be reconciled with degaussing. Electromagnetic pulses running through copper loops could neutralize magnetism, but they could not fold matter across the map. The science stops long before the rumour begins, and yet to unsettled sailors, returning home with fragments of strange memories, the transformation from mundane science to myth had already begun. Think for a moment about wartime conditions. Crews were exhausted, fed a diet of secrecy, often told not to question technical measures. Engineers ran powerful currents through ships, while warning crew to keep their distance from live wires. A sailor standing on deck might feel vibration, hair standing on end, eyes catching flashlight coronas rippling across the structure. It wouldn't take much retelling for those sensations to morph into the legend of invisibility fields. Once whispered in a few bunk rooms, the tale could gain allegorical weight. A secret project, experimental equipment, mysterious side effects. That's the kind of story a superstitious or suspicious culture eats alive, and in an age conditioned to expect secret technologies, whispers about cloaking found eager listeners. The trouble with sticking to the purely scientific explanation is that it doesn't account for human imagination under stress. Picture a barracks filled with young sailors inventing ghost stories to explain their buzzing ship. They lacked the electrical vocabulary to make sense of what was happening, so metaphors slipped in instead. She vanished. He flickered. It disappeared before my eyes. In reality, a bright corona discharge could partially obscure outlines in mist. Heavy electromagnetic effects could scramble radios. Compasses spun wrong during current surges, as though the ship itself had stepped outside the world's logic. Blame unfinished technical training combined with exhaustion, and the rumour grows naturally. The more ordinary explanation of degaussing doesn't dissolve the legend. It fuels it by being half strange and half explainable. A story that feels plausible because people experience just enough oddity to invite greater claims. By the time Carl Allen weaved his letters about ships vanishing, this backdrop of misunderstood degaussing procedures gave the narrative spine. The Eldridge could be wrapped in power, appear to shimmer, scramble instruments. From there, rumours spun easily. Maybe the ship wasn't simply mine-proof, maybe it was radar-proof too. From radar-proof to invisible to the eye, the shift is small in the mind of conspiracy. And from invisible to teleported, all it takes is one compared sighting at another port. Fact blurs with timing discrepancies, a sailor sees a similar ship docked, rumours fuse, and suddenly the Philadelphia experiment is born. Degaussing had given a visual basis for awe, but speculation gave it extra story architecture. If it was only about degaussing, none of us would still be talking about it. We dismiss glowing auras as ordinary high-voltage side effects. But eyewitness claims wrap this wartime process in something grander. So the question lingers. Was invisibility a misinterpreted protection method, or was something beyond that hidden behind the Navy's silence? We can say with certainty that real technology was strange enough to be misunderstood, but we cannot erase how those misunderstandings hardened into myth. And if sailors swore they saw more than electric haze, maybe the glow concealed a fragment of truth stranger than the Navy ever admitted. That's the hinge. Legitimate science provided the soil, but conspiracy grew in the cracks. And so the question remains, what if the wires weren't just humming? What if the most dramatic claims carried a kernel of truth beneath the noise? Picture yourself by the docks on a humid afternoon, the kind where the air tastes metallic from nearby machinery. The USS Eldridge rests in the water, its steel body steady and unremarkable, until coils whine at a frequency too low to ignore. Sparks crown the hull in jagged bursts, green-blue light shimmering across its surface like oil on a puddle. And then, for those who swear they saw it, steel did not hold form. The lines of the destroyer seemed to blur, edges fraying into haze before the vessel dissolved entirely. Imagine standing there and blinking furiously, convinced your eyes betrayed you. When you open them again, nothing. The water churns, but the ship is gone. That exact detail, the sudden disappearance of a battleship-sized war machine in plain daylight, sat at the heart of Philadelphia experiment lore. Not hidden on radar, not merely cloaked in a visual trick, but removed from the stage of reality altogether. Eyewitness accounts don't stop at vanishing. Some say the Eldridge did more than fade. It reappeared shortly after, not in Philadelphia but in Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away. The claim suggests more than invisibility. It suggests instantaneous relocation, a complete uprooting from one harbour to another. To someone watching from Norfolk's docks, a destroyer appeared almost abruptly where it had no business being. No naval movement, no slow crawl across coastline, just arrival. Without context or logs explaining movement, the story bloomed into teleportation. From there, the myth matured, not just an invisible ship, but proof of wartime experiments tearing at the walls of space and distance. The tale grew legs both terrifying and tantalizing. Of course, Navy documents reject this claim. Logs place the Eldridge operating in entirely different waters, performing routine service runs far from Philadelphia on the day the event supposedly occurred. The official timeline reads clean. Standard missions, no anomalies, no sudden teleportation whatsoever. If the paperwork is accurate, the Eldridge couldn't have vanished, because it wasn't even where witnesses claimed it was in the first place. That creates two sharply opposed realities: the bureaucratic clarity of naval reports and the chaotic murk of eyewitness testimony. Who do you trust? Official records can be tampered with, believers argue, while skeptics note that memory can twist and distort, especially under stress. it becomes a choice between the consistency of ink and the fragility of recollection. Testimonies of sailors themselves complicate matters further. Some reports describe men stumbling off deck after the alleged reappearance, disoriented and shaking, complaining of sudden burns across their bodies. The wounds described weren't clean, like cuts or bruises, but resembled radiation scarring. Patterns of raw skin, dizziness and nausea, symptoms uncomfortably similar to poisoning from electromagnetic exposure. Others claimed hallucinations struck soon afterward. Phantom figures drifted in sight lines, shadows bent strangely in daylight, and men spoke of shifting colours flooding their vision. If these stories truly came from witnesses, then the effects weren't limited to the ship but etched into human biology. Instead of science fiction teleportation, the scenario reads like uncontrolled exposure to forces too wild to manage. And yet, there is no trail of hospital records or burial rosters proving casualties. That absence feeds, rather than quiets, speculation. What unsettled listeners most wasn't just one consistent set of reports. It was the inconsistencies. Some said the entire ship was gone for only minutes. Others swore it vanished for hours. In a few dramatic accounts, the rematerialization went wrong, with crew members embedded within steel walls, limbs protruding grotesquely before vanishing again beneath riveted plating. These ghost ship-style descriptions feel part horror story, part cautionary tale. In those images, the ship becomes more than a military vessel. It becomes a haunted construct, its bulk a tomb for twisted physics. The variations in details don't weaken the conspiracy, they intensify it, because they suggest something happened, something bizarre enough that no two men could agree cleanly what they saw. That muddy testimony, unanchored from clear evidence, serves as fertile ground for decades of speculation. Consider the psychology involved. A witness certain the ship disappeared may not agree on how long or how far, but conviction plants roots deeper than exact detail ever could. And for the wider audience hearing these stories second or third hand, those contradictions don't read as failure. They read as traces of trauma too great to express coherently. An accident in reality itself, some say, could hardly be remembered cleanly by those who lived it. To conspiracy enthusiasts, the mess of retelling simply proves the stakes and the secrecy. If something this monumental cracked open even for a moment, memory itself might splinter under the strain. The visual motif carries enormous weight, a behemoth of steel swallowing itself into green-blue haze, breaking the logic of ordinary sight and then crashing back into visibility like a monster breaching from the depths. This is how the legend seared its imagery into American folklore. The glow mattered not just for spectacle, but for symbolism. Corona discharges from high-voltage experiments translated seamlessly into supernatural auras. A ripple of light weaving around the hull of the Eldridge could look prophetic, biblical even, to men used to oil lamps more than our experimental coils. Within seconds, the Navy's utilitarian experiment became myth-making theatre for those unlucky or lucky enough to observe it. So here we are, confronted with two layers. On one side, coherence, meticulous naval records that ground the Eldridge in the daily tedium of war operations far from rumoured sites. On the other, chaos, sailors' anxiety-driven recollections of light, disappearance, burns and fractured reality. The myth thrives precisely in this clash. The neatness of documentation clashes with the messiness of human memory, and the dissonance invites suspicion. If you believe in secrecy, the Navy's clarity feels too perfect. If you believe in reason, sailors' confusion looks like fertile ground for tall tales. In this vacuum of certainty, the Philadelphia experiment carved out permanence. What emerges isn't just a story of radar invisibility or strategic tricks, but rumours of a ship ripped violently from reality itself. That imagery keeps pulling audiences back because it transcends mere tactics. A hidden radar profile doesn't grip the imagination. A ship dematerializing into another port and returning in broken condition does. The spectacle is irresistible, hovering between narrative and nightmare, neither completely provable nor fully disprovable. It's exactly the kind of ambiguity legends thrive on, never stepping too close to certainty, and yet the disappearance is only half of the nightmare. Because if the Eldridge did snap out of space with its steel intact, what happened when it snapped back into place? That question lingers like ozone after lightning, promising consequences far worse than the sight of a vanishing ship. What price does teleportation demand? Not in theory, not in the careful equations of a physicist working late at night, but in the rough, untested conditions of a wartime experiment. For the Philadelphia experiment conspiracy, the answer was horrifying. It wasn't the steel or the ship or the sea that bore the scars, it was the men standing on deck. These stories claim the Eldridge didn't come back whole, at least not in ways the human mind can tolerate. The ship itself may have snapped back into visibility, but the sailors who lived through it supposedly paid with their bodies and their sanity. And if even a fraction of those tales held truth, the cost of that experiment was not measured in enemy ships destroyed, but in human suffering few could imagine. According to the most disturbing accounts, some sailors fused into the metal itself when the ship reappeared. Imagine walking past a bulkhead and seeing an arm protruding from the steel plating, not broken, not bloodied, but seamlessly welded into the wall as though flesh and iron had been poured together. The image is as much nightmare as description. Men frozen mid-movement, mouths open, but no longer free-moving beings. Instead, their forms became grotesque ornaments of the Eldridge, locked forever in steel. Some stories say these men screamed in agony until they died. Others insist they were already lifeless when spotted, trapped in silence within the ship's body. Either way, the legend insists that human form and naval machinery tried to occupy the same space, and only the cold weight of steel survived intact. Not all of the sailors supposedly fused with the ship. Rumours insist that many more survived the reappearance, but carried a different curse. These men phased in and out of visibility, like ghostly phantoms walking the decks. At times they could be seen clearly, uniforms and faces obvious. In the next instant they were half there, torsos fading, limbs transparent, voices echoing from bodies that looked incomplete. Their crewmates would reach out to steady them during these episodes, but sometimes the attempt ended badly. Stories spread of sailors vanishing completely when touched, and of terrifying moments when would-be rescuers found their hands locked in immaterial matter, unable to pull free until both men jolted back into harsh physical reality. The mental toll may have been even worse. Reports of sailors losing their minds appeared alongside the horror stories of fused bodies. Some allegedly wandered the decks in states of complete confusion, muttering strings of disconnected words that never resolved into sense. Others collapsed with violent convulsions, eyes rolling back as if their bodies remembered something their conscious minds couldn't hold. Time itself, according to the law, became unstable for them. In the conspiratorial language of the era, these men suffered from time sickness, caught between the flow of hours as the rest of the world experienced them, and some distorted rhythm only they could sense. They were alive, but they were no longer synchronized to reality. There's one element that chills even further: the claim of voices coming from inside the walls. Sailors who supposedly survived the event whispered that they heard calls for help, echoing under the floorboards, shouts coming from within solid bulkheads. To them, these weren't imaginary sounds. They believed they were hearing trapped shipmates who had reappeared improperly, their entire bodies embedded in the Eldridge's infrastructure. These cries would come suddenly in the middle of the night, fading just as suddenly. Listeners swore the voices belonged to men they recognized, men who were missing but never found. It is difficult to imagine a more brutal fate. The body absorbed by the ship, the voice still calling, but no escape possible. To make sense of these stories, one metaphor seems to capture it better than facts alone. The crew reduced to fractured echoes of their former selves. They became living half-reflections, as if their molecules had been shattered by some process no one could anticipate. A normal sailor is flesh and memory and motion. These men, according to the rumours, became fragments of all three. Minds slipping in and out of coherence, bodies unable to anchor fully into existence. Existence and memories scrambled beyond recognition. Even when they were seen walking around base after the incident, survivors were described as unsettling to be near. Their presence was off, their eyes unfocused, their behaviour erratic. They were not the men who had left port. The terrifying irony is that the ship emerged seemingly unharmed. Steel plating, rivets, propellers, none bore the same visible cost that the sailors allegedly did. This inversion makes the terror sharper. Machines endured, but humans broke. The Eldridge floated in the water as though nothing had happened, but the men who walked off it were no longer complete. The image sticks because it plays into a deep fear that technology might protect the tool and destroy the operator. In that sense, the Philadelphia experiment's horror isn't about a ship passing through dimensions or space. It is about human beings treated like expendable experiments, raw material for tests in forces no one could control. Even if no logs record these tragedies, the sheer persistence of the claim shows how powerful the imagery became. Whenever sailors told and retold the story, the focus was always less on the ship's disappearance and more on what happened when it came back. A vessel flickering in and out of view might stir curiosity, but a human body disfigured, spliced into bulkheads, or cursed with slipping in and out of time, that creates dread. And dread always outlasts facts, because it feeds off imagination, speculation, and the primal knowledge that we ourselves could be reduced to nothing more than a scream locked behind a wall of steel. The Philadelphia experiment endures not because it suggests advanced technology, but because it forces us to imagine the human body at war with reality itself. If the stories even remotely captured real events, the cost of bending physics was unbearable. A ship re-emerged intact, but its crew bore the unthinkable price. And that's what leaves the deeper mark. Machines may survive, but people don't always come back the same. The true horror of this legend isn't invisibility, teleportation, or even secret technology. The true horror lies in broken men, twisted into beings no longer fully human. And it's this human nightmare that pushes the conspiracy into its next leap. Because if the Eldridge really left Philadelphia, fused men and fractured minds beg the bigger question: where exactly had the ship gone during those missing moments? Why settle for invisibility when the rumour could reach for something even stranger, time itself? Once whispers about glowing fields and disappearing steel began to circulate, the next leap in speculation was almost inevitable. If a ship could vanish from one place and reappear in another, what if it also left the boundaries of the present moment? The theories widened to suggest the USS Eldridge didn't just slip across seafronts, but could have fallen into a loop of time, vanishing from 1943 only to resurface somewhere, or somewhen else. For believers, this was no longer about avoiding radar or mines. It was about cracking open the flow of history and stumbling into centuries that were not meant to be visited. One popular tale folded into this idea came years later through a man named Al Bielek. He claimed not only to have been on board during the experiment, but also to have been thrown far into the future. His story described a leap hundreds of years ahead, into time shaped by advanced societies and ruined landscapes. Elements of his recollection sound closer to science fiction than remembered history, but they cemented a powerful idea. If the Eldridge was caught in some uncontrolled field, then both space and time might have lost their grip on the ship. Bielek insisted he travelled through eras we have yet to live, returning only through another experimental jump. Those details may collapse under scrutiny, but the claim itself added a spine of time travel to a myth that had already mutated well beyond invisibility cloaks. The Montauk Law strengthened this frame, linking the Philadelphia experiment to tales of hidden programs decades later. Montauk myths painted a world where time tunnels could be opened and manipulated, where individuals could step from one decade into another through unstable gates powered by secret machinery. In these tellings, what happened in Philadelphia wasn't a one-off malfunction, but the prototype for programs that stretched into the Cold War and beyond, with experiments allegedly operating on Long Island in hidden bases. Even if Montauk's stories remain unproven, the magnetism between the two conspiracies was strong. In retellings, the Eldridge functioned as the first dangerous push, while Montauk represented the refinement of that dangerous frontier. Without the ship's story, later claims about engineered time travel might never have found such fertile ground. But how do you even picture something like that happening? Conspiratorial speculation often mentions the idea of an uncontrolled hyperspace bubble. Picture the ship encased in an electromagnetic cocoon, energized until it no longer resonated with the same time frame as the surrounding world. In this scenario, the sailors trapped within were still rooted in the field's bubble, but the bubble itself had slipped outside normal coordinates. Men phasing in and out of sight could be explained as side effects of instability. The bubble couldn't hold them, so their atoms flickered between dimensions or between time frames, unable to anchor properly. Fused bodies and confused memories in this frame aren't symbolic horrors. They would be literal symptoms of having your molecular state stretched across incompatible realities. It reads like mad science, but within the myth, it neatly explains the chaos the sailors supposedly endured. Stories of time sickness fit snugly into this idea as well. If the field placed the men even slightly out of step with the world's clock, they might experience time at an offset. Hours could drag like days, or entire minutes could vanish with a blink. For those caught in such an offset, ordinary living would feel impossible. Minds would fracture not because of trauma alone, but because sensory input no longer matched what everyone else experienced. Even ordinary activities, breathing air, listening to footsteps, watching a clock hand, would unravel. Such speculation gave conspiracists a ready-made label for every inconsistency in testimony. The confusion of witnesses wasn't proof nothing happened, but evidence of ruptured perception itself. When folded together, these ideas transform the Philadelphia experiment into a cautionary tale about the birth of unexpected wormholes. A ship seeking stealth ran headlong into forces that fragmented perception, location, and chronology. What began as rumour about radar invisibility escalated into visions of accidental portals into the unknown. If true, this would not have been just military stealth gone awry. It would have been the first man-made rupture in the fabric of space-time. Whether the ship slipped from Philadelphia to Norfolk or Philadelphia to some far-off century, the language remained enticing. An uncontrolled wormhole generator, born not in a physics lab but under wartime secrecy. The extraordinary quality of these claims shouldn't overshadow why they struck a nerve. The 1940s were a decade where science outran common understanding at terrifying speed. Nuclear weapons ended the war with incomprehensible destruction. Jet engines redefined speed in the air. Radar itself, once speculative, had become standard. Science was producing effects that defied ordinary explanation, so when told of a ship that blinked away, listeners were ready to believe it might also slip into tomorrow or yesterday. In that cultural atmosphere, time travel didn't read as an absurd escalation. It read as the next step on a ladder already built from nuclear fire and supersonic jets. Think of how rumours evolve. Each generation adds more distance from the initial event, but also adds layers of imagination. One man's letter about radar invisibility grows into tales of teleportation. Another storyteller comes along and says teleportation isn't nearly strange enough, and suddenly time steps into the picture. By the time Bielek's narratives enter the stage decades later, a missing destroyer has become a foundation stone for entire conjectures about humanity's manipulation of time. the myth doesn't fade with each exaggeration. It expands, becoming harder to dismiss outright because to disprove one version doesn't silence the next. With every escalation, the Philadelphia experiment cloaks itself in deeper mystery. Ask yourself, if even one crewman truly experienced a dislocation in time, what would that mean for recorded history? Conspiracy writers imagine possibilities stretching wild. Sailors slipping centuries into the future, government labs harvesting knowledge from yet-to-come societies, even the idea of crewmen lost forever to centuries where no one could rescue them. For believers, the Eldridge was less a naval ship and more a vessel through history itself. Survivors weren't unlucky test subjects. They were accidental time travellers, fractured explorers, and in some versions, emissaries who glimpsed futures our world isn't ready for. All of this spirals from a single seed: invisibility. A defensive experiment meant to keep ships safe at sea grew into humanity's accidental dance with the dimensions that rule existence. In the conspiracy's logic, the Philadelphia experiment stumbled upon principles later exploited by shadow projects from Montauk to beyond. Whether by uncontrolled bubbles or intentional refinement, the destination was the same: command of time. And here, for the first time in the myth, physics had shifted from a shield for sailors to a godlike tool for rewriting destiny itself. It is here that the story tangles into broader names and bigger legacies. Because if a naval ship in 1943 cracked open time itself, then surely the theories of towering minds, figures like Tesla or von Neumann, would not be far behind. The tale jumps from ordinary sailors to legendary inventors, dragging ghosts of brilliance into the same speculative glow that surrounded the Eldridge. And so, from broken men and skipping clocks, the narrative now shifts toward the question: whose ideas could have made such a rupture possible? Did Nikola Tesla's work live on after his death, guiding experiments he never finished? That question hangs like a ghost over the story of the Philadelphia experiment. Tesla died in January of 1943, just months before the USS Eldridge supposedly disappeared at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. By that time, his reputation was a strange mix of celebrated genius and eccentric recluse. To admirers, he was a pioneer who touched the edge of mysteries the rest of science hadn't yet approached. To skeptics, he was a fading inventor whose best ideas had already passed. Against that backdrop, it's no surprise his name attached itself to the Philadelphia experiment like a magnet. If such a bizarre event had occurred, who else but Tesla could have planted the seeds? Rumours insist the Navy quietly acquired his papers after his death. Government agents were said to have catalogued boxes full of his notebooks, prototypes, and half-finished diagrams. Most referenced familiar ground: oscillators, wireless transmission, high-voltage coils. But conspiracy writers saw more: blueprints that edged toward manipulation of fields larger than mere electricity. Tesla had spoken, late in life, about energy that could be broadcast without wires, and about controlling frequencies with unmatched precision. He dreamed openly of transmitting power globally through resonance. In speculative hindsight, that line of research looks like a stepping stone to radical manipulation of electromagnetism, maybe even stretching into invisibility. If Navy engineers sifted through his estate, pulling what could be useful, the stage was set for his ghost to linger over Philadelphia. There are scattered connections, even outside conspiracy writing, that show the Navy had an interest in electromagnetic research. Tesla himself once spoke of shielding ships by interfering with magnetic detection, an idea that does sound like a route for degaussing technology. But the rumours go further. Whispered accounts suggest he pursued an idea known to conspiracists as a zero-time reference generator. This mysterious device, supposedly born out of Tesla's arcane mathematics, was said to lock an object outside of the usual frame of time, anchoring it in an artificial bubble. In that imagined space, the object would no longer respond to normal physics. Light would deflect strangely, Matter might shift and time would pass unevenly compared to the outside world. Place a destroyer within such a field, and you've constructed a plausible recipe for disappearance. What makes Tesla so easy to slide into this story is that he really had created effects that looked magical to casual observers. His famous demonstrations included turning on lamps without wires, generating arcs of noise and light that filled entire auditoriums, and producing electrical surges that seemed to pass through his body unharmed. To many, he was already manipulating forces invisible to everyone else. In New York, neighbours of his labs sometimes complained of shocks and vertigo when walking near the building, effects caused by the immense currents he experimented with. Those incidents echo, for conspiracy believers, in the tales of sailors plagued by burns and hallucinations. If Tesla had once inadvertently sickened passers-by with his coils, then it seems only natural, within the myth, that his scaled-up research could have rattled the crew of the Eldridge more violently. But there's always a tension when trying to separate fact from imagination. Tesla's verifiable experiments ended in devices that use clear laws of physics, sometimes misunderstood by laypeople but grounded in established science. He mastered alternating current, oscillators, transformers. These were not guesses. They became the backbone of the modern grid. By contrast, the leap to controlling space-time rests entirely on extrapolation. Modern physics doesn't link his known work directly to wormholes or invisibility fields. That gap is both the weakness and the power of the conspiracy. Skeptics point out the absence of any actual evidence connecting Tesla to dimensions beyond electromagnetism. Believers focus instead on how easily his unfinished notes could have been repurposed in secrecy. When a genius dies and his work vanishes into government archives, silence itself becomes an argument for hidden potential. It also matters how he was mythologized after death. Tesla had become, by the late 20th century, emblematic of suppressed brilliance. Pop culture painted him as the tragic visionary whose genius was stolen, hidden, or ignored. That narrative pairs perfectly with a story like the Philadelphia experiment. If the Navy carried out reality-bending tests, who better to cast as the absent architect than a man already seen as mistreated and misunderstood? He becomes the patron saint of forbidden science, not because we can trace the equations, but because the legend needs a scientist whose legend carries the weight of awe. Without Tesla's shadow, the experiment looks like a jumble of rumours. With him hovering in the margins, it feels like destiny denied to the public. The zero-time reference generator itself deserves one more look, not because it has foundation in Tesla's published work, but because it stitches together the horrors of the Eldridge with the figure of Tesla himself. If such a device existed, locking a ship outside of our regular frame, the side effects line up darkly with the sailors' complaints. Burns could be reinterpreted as exposure to unstable fields. Men phasing in and out might be read as humans trapped half inside, half outside of a bubble that failed to hold clean boundaries. Cognitive collapse could stem from perception itself recoiling at a disrupted timeline. In this interpretation, the men of the Eldridge weren't a mystery. They were collateral damage in a test of Tesla's cosmic-scale physics. Those speculations let the Philadelphia experiment's narrative match its most famous name with its most famous terrors. It's worth noting, too, how conspiracists frame the handover of knowledge. They often portray Tesla not as a direct participant, he died before 1943, but as the provider of seeds. His unfinished ideas allegedly landed in wartime research vaults, picked apart by less imaginative but more pragmatic engineers. These engineers didn't understand all his mathematics, the story goes, but they had wartime urgency and resources. They pushed ahead recklessly, replicating phenomena without caring for cost. The Eldridge was not Tesla's experiment, according to this telling. It was the tragic misuse of his genius by others. That narrative keeps his reputation intact as a visionary, while shifting the blame for human suffering to military secrecy. This balance between a genius who built the modern electrical world and a ghostly architect of space-time cataclysm, is exactly why his name won't leave the story. Tesla fits both ends of the legend. He's the documented inventor whose coils really did hum with strange effects, and the spectral mind credited for pulling an entire ship out of reality. The more unverifiable the claims, the more necessary his name becomes. In that way, he becomes a kind of mythic figurehead of the Philadelphia experiment, forever split between the world of patents and the world of ghost stories. And so, in conspiracy culture, Tesla never truly died. He lingers at the edge of the Eldridge's glow, his spectral notes strewn across a shipyard experiment in 1943. Whether or not his work ever touched the Navy's hands, the tale crowns him. The implied engineer of a rupture humanity wasn't ready for. The Philadelphia experiment needed a mythic mind, and Tesla provided it, even posthumously. He is the ghost in the machine, the missing presence without which the story might collapse under its own weight. But if we indulge the idea that pieces of his work were stolen, turned into unseen tests of cosmic machinery, we're left with a darker question. If Tesla's notes seeded the Philadelphia experiment, what else was quietly harvested, locked away, and hidden under the weight of government secrecy, waiting for another opportunity to surface? Step away from Tesla's ghost for a moment and think about what came next. If the Philadelphia experiment really did flicker across a naval yard in 1943, it didn't vanish into silence. It slipped instead into the shadow of a world about to fracture again. The Second World War had ended, but the Cold War began almost immediately after. Two great powers circling each other mistrust their constant companion. In that atmosphere, secrecy wasn't just protection, it was strategy. And stories like the Eldridge's disappearance found soil far richer than rumour alone. The Cold War wasn't only missiles, walls and proxy wars, it was imagination weaponised. Both East and West gambled on unproven sciences, afraid that if the other side got there first, the balance of power would tilt forever. Rockets, satellites, nuclear submarines, those were the public face. Behind locked doors, stranger projects whispered into being. Weather control, psychic research, radiation tests, invisible tools for invisible wars. Once you know that, a story about a ship swallowed by green haze no longer feels like a lonely legend. It feels like a piece of the larger fabric. The United States had already learned how to keep a secret. The Manhattan Project had hidden over 130,000 workers across the country, entire cities built around laboratories that few outsiders knew existed. If such a vast operation could be concealed until the atomic bomb revealed itself in fire, then any scale of secrecy seemed possible. That lesson carried forward into the Cold War. The new enemy was suspicion itself, and suspicion required silence. Into that silence poured the first real post-war black programs. Many were practical: stealth aircraft, guidance computers, nuclear propulsion. But some drifted toward the speculative. The stranger, the rumour. The easier it was to believe that somewhere someone in uniform was trying it. That's why the Philadelphia experiment didn't die after the war. It grew, retold in barracks, pulp magazines and whispered recollections. Against a background where secret projects thrived, a tale of vanishing steel fit perfectly. In 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency launched a project it called MK-Ultra. On paper, it was about behavioural modification. In practice, it was a scattershot attempt to see how far the human mind could be pushed, bent or broken. Prisoners were dosed with LSD. College students signed consent forms without understanding the risks. Even some CIA operatives found themselves unwilling test subjects, drugged by their own colleagues in the name of data. Hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, all were pulled into the mix. For 2 decades, the program ran beneath layers of classification. Victims who spoke out were dismissed as unstable. Families who asked questions were met with silence. Only in 1975, when the Church Committee began peeling back fragments of classified history, did the public learn what had happened. Even then, the truth was partial. Many of the records had been destroyed 2 years earlier, in 1973, under orders to reduce exposure. What survived was enough. Proof that secrecy could be a license to cross moral boundaries most would never imagine. Now put that beside the Philadelphia experiment. A Navy ship humming with coils, men damaged by invisible forces, a legend buried under denial. And then, decades later, a CIA program exposed that proved government agencies had indeed sacrificed unwitting citizens in the pursuit of the impossible. To conspiracy believers, the parallel was too close to ignore. If MKUltra was real, then why not Philadelphia? If one black program shredded minds in secret, then perhaps another had shredded matter itself. This is how myths survive. Not through perfect consistency, but through resonance. The specifics of the Eldridge may remain disputed, but the pattern feels true. Secrecy, human suffering, denial, and eventual fragments of confirmation. MKUltra became the confirmation believers needed. It whispered that the world really did work this way, that governments would gamble lives on projects too strange to be admitted in daylight. And it wasn't just America. Across the Iron Curtain, stories surfaced about Soviet research into telepathy, remote viewing, and psychotronic weapons. Western intelligence agencies tracked these rumors with unease. Even if the results were exaggerated, the possibility that the Soviets might stumble onto something first was enough to keep funding flowing. This created a hall of mirrors. The US poured money into psychic experiments because it feared the Soviets might succeed. The Soviets did the same, fearing the Americans. In that loop, even the wildest rumors carried weight. If the Americans had tested invisibility in Philadelphia, maybe the Soviets had their own version buried deep in frozen laboratories. The Cold War didn't just tolerate conspiracy, it generated it, each side projecting its darkest suspicions onto the other. By the 1980s, the Philadelphia story fused with a new one, Montauk. On Long Island, at a decommissioned radar site called Camp Hero, rumours claimed experiments in time travel and psychic projection had taken place. Central to this was Al Bielek, who insisted he had been aboard the Eldridge and hurled centuries into the future. His testimony was tangled, inconsistent, and often impossible to verify. Yet his voice stitched two stories into one: Philadelphia as prototype, Montauk as continuation. You don't need to retell all of Bielek's claims to see the effect. In a culture already shaken by MKUltra's revelations, people no longer dismiss such ideas as fantasy. They looked at the pattern, secret programs, human casualties, decades of denial, and concluded that Philadelphia could easily have been the first step in a much longer chain. Montauk became less a new story than an echo, the Cold War's way of breathing life back into an older myth. Picture yourself as an ordinary citizen in the 1970s. You've lived through assassinations, through Vietnam, through Watergate. You've read headlines about coups supported by intelligence agencies and surveillance spreading into homes and offices. Trust has eroded, and denial no longer reassures. When the government says this never happened, the instinct is not to believe them, it's to wonder what they're hiding. That's the psychology that kept the Philadelphia experiment alive. People no longer judge stories on evidence alone, they judge them on plausibility, and plausibility was measured by mistrust. If your leaders had lied about wars, about experiments, about surveillance, then why wouldn't they lie about a ship vanishing in 1943? In that climate, suspicion wasn't paranoia, it was protection. There's another layer too, secrecy as deterrence. Not every project needed to succeed. Sometimes the whisper alone was enough. Imagine a rival power hearing rumours that the US had found a way to make ships invisible. Even if the story was false, the uncertainty could slow them down, force them to waste resources or make them hesitate in battle. In that sense, conspiracy itself became a weapon. Myths were allowed to live because myths carried power. And that's why the Philadelphia experiment, even if never admitted, remained useful. It didn't need to be proven. It only needed to exist as a possibility. A rumour in the right place could do the work of an entire fleet. Set Philadelphia beside MKUltra and the reflection sharpens. On one side, sailors fused into bulkheads, bodies broken by fields no one could control. On the other, students and prisoners drugged into madness by chemicals slipped into their veins, both hidden under classification, both denied until too many fragments leaked, both reminders that secrecy erodes humanity first. That's the rhythm that gives the Philadelphia experiment its endurance. Even skeptics who doubt the ship ever vanished find themselves acknowledging the pattern. Black programs existed. People suffered. Denials collapsed years later. Against that record, the Eldridge doesn't feel like fantasy. It feels like a story waiting for its own declassified page. And this brings us to a darker question. If America's Cold War programs looked like this, mind control, human testing, secrecy as policy, what were its enemies doing in those same years? If MKUltra tore into thoughts and Philadelphia tore into steel, was Germany's war machine truly limited to rockets and tanks? Or did it too chase forces no one could control? The whispers say it did. They speak of an iron bell spinning in underground chambers, filled with strange fluids and guarded with desperate secrecy. Plants withered near it, and handlers sickened. They called it degaussing. If Philadelphia was America's forbidden experiment, then the bell was its European reflection, the dark mirror waiting across the ocean. Across the Atlantic, whispers told of a very different kind of machine, a device the Nazis supposedly guarded with all the desperation of an empire running out of time. It was called degaussing, the bell. The name comes from its shape, but the descriptions that surrounded it were anything but ordinary. Imagine a large vessel shaped like an iron bell, filled with strange containers of liquid metal, possibly mercury, spinning at high speed inside. According to the law, this motion produced violent radiation, glowing light, and effects none of its handlers could fully control. Some suggested plants exposed to the bell withered instantly, and people standing too close fell ill. If true, this wasn't a weapon meant for the battlefield, but an experiment reaching toward a new physics, something that could alter gravity, space, maybe even time. The bell's legend matches the tone of the Philadelphia experiment because both stories take a small kernel of wartime secrecy and expand it into forbidden science. In one, a destroyer vanishes from a harbour. In the other, a heavy machine threatens to warp the fundamental forces of nature. Both take place against the backdrop of a global war where technology shifted the balance of power overnight. Rockets, radar, and atomic fire all reshaping conflict permanently. Against that reality, the idea that scientists might try even stranger projects doesn't feel completely out of place. With Germany losing ground, rumours say its leadership clung to whatever edge they could find. An anti-gravity device or a time machine sounds absurd, but to a regime desperate to reverse its slide, pursuit of fantasies had its own logic. Descriptions of the bell often frame it as spinning cylinders, liquid mercury-like substances, and massive doses of high voltage poured into containment structures. Stories say it hung in underground mines or remote laboratories, secured tightly while scientists tested its limits. Some point to a ruin in Poland, an enigmatic concrete structure nicknamed the Henge, with circular columns that look like anchors for something enormous. Enthusiasts claim it once held the bell in tests, though others argue it was just part of an ordinary industrial cooling tower. In conspiracy culture, those details don't matter. The imagery of an otherworldly engine glowing in the dim light of secret caverns is enough. The parallels with the Eldridge's ghostly green haze are hard to ignore. Here's where the tension builds. If the Allies were working on radar invisibility, or teleportation in the eyes of conspiracy believers, then perhaps the Axis was racing towards something similar with the bell. It frames World War II not simply as a clash of nations, but as a shadow race for control over physics itself. Imagine it. Two sides secretly testing devices that strain the laws of time and space, each hoping to outpace the other before the war ended. In that picture, rockets and atomic bombs were the public face of technology, while these shadow projects served as backroom gambles. And even if both ultimately failed, the race itself would have burned deep into the imaginations of those who heard fragments of truth. This rivalry carries an even darker twist. After the war, Allied intelligence conducted Operation Paperclip, quietly moving German scientists and their research into American laboratories. Officially, the goal was to absorb rocket expertise, particularly from figures like Wernher von Braun, who would later help launch the US space program. But in the ecosystem of conspiracy theory, Paperclip becomes a cover for something grander. If Nazi scientists carried sketches, notes, or even half-tested prototypes of the bell, then those fragments could have landed in American hands, hidden under layers of secrecy. Once that possibility enters the story, threads connect naturally. Philadelphia, Teslian blueprints, Nazi experiments, and Cold War labs all feeding each other in a single quilt of forbidden science. Speculation thrives in gaps like these. Very little is known about what files moved between continents after the war. What we do know is that scientists from Germany were indeed transplanted into US programs and given new identities. That real secrecy, hiding plain careers behind smokescreens, gave enough credibility for wilder claims to piggyback. Suddenly it's plausible, within this framework, that along with rockets came other stranger projects. If the Allies and Axis had both reached for beyond the possible technologies, then the aftermath of the war didn't kill those dreams. It simply transplanted them into new soil. The cultural appeal of linking the Philadelphia experiment to the Nazi bell lives in this suggestion that both sides weren't racing simply for weapons of war, but for mastery over hidden dimensions of reality. On one coast, men vanish into the hull of a destroyer as electromagnetic fields rage. On the other, mercury-filled drums spin until gravity itself twists. Neither story is verifiable, but together they create symmetry, a mythic sense of wartime powers dabbling in forces beyond human control. A balanced fear, equally terrifying regardless of which side you imagine successful, reinforced by the secrecy of government vaults and archival shadows that have never opened fully to the public. Consider how this parallel frames history. The atomic bomb is visible proof of technological breakthroughs pushing war into undeniable horror. If that much can be shown in daylight, what about the things hidden beneath the ground or buried in classified reports? The Nazi bell becomes the missing twin of the Eldridge, the dark mirror that suggests an entire invisible war was playing out behind the headline battles. Were scientists fumbling toward the same discovery, unaware that their rivals across the world were conducting their own reckless tests? To those captivated by these legends, it seems fitting. World War II's race for dominance wasn't just about territory or strategy. It was about which civilization could command reality first. This isn't just fringe talk either. Conspiracy culture leans hard on symbolism, and in these two machines, the American destroyer enveloped in an electromagnetic haze and the German bell spinning with deadly radiation, you get that symbolism. Steel vessels straining against the cage of physics. Both ended in horror stories, fused men, sickened handlers, structures abandoned. Taken together, they suggest that humanity was never meant to command such forces. Both experiments become cautionary tales. They didn't launch fleets or change battles because they collapsed under their own weight, perhaps saving the world from slipping into chaos. Or, in the speculative twist, perhaps preventing one side from winning outright through technology, so destabilizing it would have ended history as we know it. This bridge between the Philadelphia experiment and the Nazi bell explains why these stories still cling to one another decades later. Neither could stand alone as strongly, but together they gain mythic weight. They become two sides of the same coin, two secret war machines that never leave the stage of speculation. For believers, this isn't history. It's alternate destiny. It's evidence of an era when forbidden science almost swallowed the 20th century whole, and it leaves one final thought hanging in the air. If any part of these tales was true, what became of the knowledge afterward? Paperclip scattered pieces into American hands. Secrecy wrapped everything in silence. and the Cold War lit the world with paranoia. Perhaps those fragments didn't vanish at all, but trickled quietly into strategies no public ever saw. The question then is not whether the Philadelphia experiment or the Nazi bell worked exactly as rumoured. The question is what would have happened if either project had quietly succeeded, reshaping warfare when nuclear fire was only the surface of deterrence. Because beyond wartime rivalry, it isn't hard to imagine how teleportation or control of gravity itself could have changed every calculation of power once the Cold War began. When the war ended, the headlines spoke of surrender, trials, and ruined cities. What they didn't show was the quieter migration taking place in the shadows. Knowledge itself was being smuggled across borders. It moved not just in crates of captured equipment, but in the minds of men who had built the Reich's strangest machines. Operation Paperclip became the label for this transfer, though most Americans wouldn't hear the name until years later. At the time, it was little more than a bureaucratic trick. Attach a slip of paper to a personnel file, and suddenly a scientist destined for a war crimes trial was rerouted into a new career under American protection. A clipped paper changed history more effectively than any verdict. Picture that moment in 1945. German laboratories stand half-shattered, chalkboards still covered in equations, test rigs left humming when the power failed. Amid the wreckage, Allied officers sift through piles of notes, chemical vials, and half-finished prototypes. In one corner, a nervous physicist clutches a notebook. In another, a technician offers sketches in exchange for safe passage. Each discovery is a choice. Destroy it, hand it over to prosecutors, or ship it back across the ocean. And for officials haunted by the fear of Soviet advances, the choice was almost always the same. Better to hide these fragments in American vaults than let them be absorbed into Moscow's. The most famous name carried over was Wernher von Braun, the rocket engineer whose V2 terrorised London, and who would later direct the Saturn V toward the moon. But von Braun was only the visible face of a much larger influx. Hundreds of chemists, engineers, and theorists followed, often with their records rewritten to disguise Nazi ties. Officially, this was about propulsion and aviation. Unofficially, the scope sprawled wider. Radiation studies, high-voltage trials, exotic metallurgy, all were swept into the net. And this is where the Philadelphia experiment begins to re-enter the frame. Because if the Reich had pursued something like Die Glocke, the bell, its fragments could have travelled with these men. Not as polished blueprints, perhaps, but as sketches, notebooks, even untested formulas carried in memory. Wars usually redistribute territory. This one redistributed imagination. Scientists became the real spoils, parcelled out between the United States and the Soviet Union like rare minerals. Operation Paperclip pulled thousands westward. Soviet equivalents, though less publicised, hauled laboratories east. The result was a diaspora of unfinished research scattered into the two most secretive empires the world has ever known. Think about what that means. If one nation captured a researcher who had toyed with high-frequency electromagnetics, and the other seized a man who had dabbled with spinning mercury at high velocity, the war did not erase those pursuits. It transplanted them. The battlefield shifted from bombed-out factories in Germany to hidden facilities in New Mexico and the Urals. And once transplanted, the projects could mutate, merging with local ambitions, taking on new forms. In that frame, the Philadelphia experiment ceases to look like a lone American anomaly. It looks like one symptom in a wider network of dangerous curiosities passed hand to hand under new flags. Part of the intrigue comes from what vanished. Many paperclip files were sanitized, references to Nazi Party membership erased, histories of forced labour quietly omitted. That same concealment infects the rumours of technology. If a regime was willing to launder crimes for utility, why not also launder experimental ideas too volatile to mention openly? Believers argue that the same process that scrubbed resumes could also have scrubbed project titles, disguising outlandish experiments as mundane research. A sketch of a rotating bell powered by high voltage might simply be recatalogued under advanced materials testing. And because the documents were incomplete, imagination filled the gaps. Where the records are whole, we talk about rockets. Where they are redacted or missing, we whisper about gravity machines and invisible ships. That imbalance feeds conspiracy like oxygen. In the American Southwest, bases like White Sands and Fort Bliss became homes to these imported mines. Officially, their focus was propulsion and rocketry. Yet rumours spread of stranger trials taking place, electromagnetic pulses tested on equipment, unusual fuels handled behind sealed doors, aircraft subjected to experiments in high-voltage stress. To the public, these were the normal growing pains of a defence industry racing into the jet age. To conspiracy culture, they were continuations of whatever had begun in Europe's caverns. If a diagram of the bell's core ended up in a box shipped west, who would have known the difference? A stack of papers labelled rotational physics or liquid metal tests could easily disappear into the sprawl of classified research. And if young American engineers asked too many questions, they were reminded of the obvious. The Soviets were racing just as hard. Curiosity became suspicion, and suspicion was silenced. Across the Iron Curtain, the mirror reflected back. The Soviets captured their own engineers and their own fragments. In later decades, Western intelligence worried about psychotronic weapons, about Soviet advances in telepathy or electromagnetic manipulation. Most of those worries proved exaggerated, but the fear kept both sides pouring money into speculative projects. Each imagined the other might already hold the key. That hall of mirrors transformed a rumour into reality. Even if no one had a working device, the possibility was treated as fact. And in that climate, the Philadelphia experiment was never just a sailor's ghost story. It was evidence, at least to believers, that America had touched something impossible first, and then hidden it in the vaults, while rivals scrambled to catch up. Paperclip also exposed a moral fracture. Many of the men recruited had supervised factories where forced labourers suffered and died. Instead of facing trials, they received contracts, paychecks, and suburban houses. Bureaucratic sleight of hand erased their pasts, replacing condemnation with employment. If human rights could be scrubbed away that easily, what chance did truth have? To those who study conspiracy, this is the smoking gun. A government willing to excuse atrocities for rockets might not hesitate to excuse dangerous science as well. Think of the sailors in the Philadelphia story, fused into bulkheads, broken by forces they never agreed to test. Then think of prisoners experimented on in German camps, or civilians drugged unknowingly in CIA mind control trials. The thread is consistent. The individual sacrifice for the sake of advantage, the human body treated as raw material in the pursuit of knowledge. Paperclip doesn't weaken that thread. It strengthens it by showing how utility outweighed morality at the highest levels. There are ruins that conspiracy theorists circle like moths. In Poland, the Henge, a concrete structure with massive pillars, still stands. To mainstream historians, it was likely a cooling tower for industrial equipment. To others, it looks like a skeletal harness built to anchor the bell during its tests. When Soviet troops scoured the region, the structure was left behind, but the records vanished. Scientists associated with the project disappeared into silence, their careers untraceable. In America, there are echoes of the same pattern. Facilities where paperclip scientists worked often leave behind no clear public record of what was attempted. Declassified snippets reference field effects, rotational stresses, or high-energy containment. None of it proves Philadelphia, but none of it disproves it either. The silence becomes suggestive, just as Carl Allen's letters once did. Absence itself hardens into evidence. Notice the shape this takes. A wartime story about a vanishing destroyer is joined by a German story about a spinning bell. Both are then braided into a post-war program that transplanted scientists into rival empires. The myths migrate with the men. They echo across languages and borders, gaining new weight because the machinery of secrecy is visible. The names of laboratories change, but the rhythm stays the same. Strange devices, official denials, fragments of testimony that survive long enough to feed rumour. And in this rhythm, believers see continuity rather than coincidence. To them, Paperclip isn't a separate story. It's the connective tissue, the mechanism by which forbidden ideas survive the end of the war. Philadelphia becomes Act 1, the Bell becomes Act 2, and Paperclip ensures there was always going to be an Act 3. There's another angle often overlooked, what it meant to inherit not just people, but unfinished dreams. A scientist uprooted from Germany to New Mexico brought more than blueprints. He brought speculation, untested hunches, sketches never validated. When those fragments landed in American or Soviet labs, they were treated as starting points, not as abandoned curiosities. In that way, even errors could metastasize into new projects. What if the Bell was misinterpreted notes, a fever dream of an engineer? Once carried into a new empire, it could still be reconstructed, tested, even expanded, because the myth was as valuable as the math. And this raises the most troubling question. Did secrecy preserve genius, or did it amplify madness? If Philadelphia was the reckless offspring of misunderstood physics, then Paperclip guaranteed there would be cousins scattered everywhere. Ideas don't die when transplanted. They evolve, even if their roots are toxic. World War II ended on paper in 1945, but through Paperclip its shadow stretched forward. The laboratories didn't shut down, they relocated. The experiments didn't vanish, they adapted. The war for territory ended, but the war for reality itself, who could bend it, who could weaponize it, continued under new management. And this is why, decades later, the Philadelphia experiment still resonates. It is not remembered in isolation. It is remembered as part of a broader system where secrecy was strategy, morality was negotiable, and fragments of forbidden science migrated like contraband. Once you accept that scientists were transplanted wholesale, you don't need much imagination to believe their more dangerous ideas travelled too. So the story of Paperclip is not just about rockets that reach the moon. It is about the quiet replanting of knowledge, some proven, some poisonous, some perhaps impossible. It is about how governments learned to treat science as plunder, and how myths rode inside that plunder like stowaways. And it is about how legends like Philadelphia survive, not as isolated accidents, but as parts of a much larger diaspora. Because once you know imagination itself was harvested, you have to wonder what else was carried away in those manila folders and classified crates. What sketches lay buried in American vaults? What fragments disappeared into Soviet archives? And what seeds, planted in silence, have yet to bloom in the world we think we know? Operation Paperclip had scattered fragments of forbidden science like seeds across 2 continents. German engineers who once worked in underground caverns and shattered laboratories were suddenly walking American bases in New Mexico and Soviet research halls deep in the Urals. Officially, their tasks were rockets and metallurgy. But behind those new assignments lurked sketches, unfinished notes, and strange, half-tested devices that never saw the light of war. It was within that atmosphere of secrets transplanted from ruins that the Philadelphia experiment began to look less like an isolated legend and more like a doorway cracked open. If even a fragment of the Eldridge's story were true, then what had surfaced in 1943 was not just a failed trial of electromagnetic tricks. It was the beginning of a thought experiment too dangerous to pursue. The question could no longer be avoided. What if teleportation wasn't only rumour? What if it had worked, even for an instant? Wars are fought on distance and time. A fleet is only as strong as its fuel convoys, its supply lines, its ability to cross oceans before the enemy prepares. Every empire in history has been measured by how quickly it could move armies from one horizon to another. Teleportation would erase that equation instantly. No convoys crawling for weeks across the Atlantic, no slow arcs of aircraft refueling mid-air, no endless charts of tonnage and attrition. A destroyer squadron could materialize at a rival's harbour in the span of a breath. An aircraft carrier group could appear outside Moscow before breakfast. If such a weapon existed, geography itself would lose meaning. The very idea of defence built on borders and oceans would dissolve. Nuclear weapons already made the world tremble, but they at least carried a dreadful stability. They were too destructive to use lightly, their consequences too visible. Teleportation would offer the opposite temptation. It would be too convenient not to use, too subtle to resist. Wars would no longer build in steady escalations. They would ignite out of nowhere, with fleets appearing in enemy waters and vanishing again before alarms could even sound. And in the Cold War that followed World War II, this possibility would have been even more destabilizing than missiles in silos. A single rumour of such power would keep generals awake at night, watching empty skies while wondering if unseen ships already circled their coasts. It would not only transform fleets, it would turn armies into ghosts. Special forces could appear in the heart of enemy capitals without ever crossing borders. Leaders could vanish from their own bedrooms, assassinated by men who left no footprints behind. Sabotage could take place in laboratories, power plants, or nuclear arsenals with no sign of intrusion. Worse still, accountability would collapse. If an explosion shattered a rival city, who was responsible? With no movement to track, no border crossing to mark, no satellite images of marching troops, every act of violence would be a mystery. War and terror would blur into the same shadow. Nations would strike back blindly, never certain who their enemy actually was. And what would such a shift do to ordinary life? Civilizations run on the slow drag of distance. Grain moves in trains. Oil creeps through pipelines. Electronics sail in containers stacked across oceans. That time lag, inconvenient though it may seem, is the rhythm that sustains markets. It allows governments to manage flows, companies to calculate costs, families to trust that the food on their tables will still be there tomorrow. Teleportation would destroy that rhythm overnight. Why pay for trade if resources can be stolen in an instant? Why bother with long contracts when factories can lose their inventories the moment goods are ready? Ownership itself would lose meaning, because anything of value could be snatched as quickly as thought. Economies would implode not because the goods vanished, but because trust did. Infrastructure would decay along with it. Bridges, ports, and airports would no longer matter. Cities designed around transit networks would become relics. The value of a home near a rail hub, the logic of warehouses clustered at harbours, even the pride of nations in highways or canals would collapse. Real estate would no longer be measured by location. Every place would be equally vulnerable. And once that realisation spread, property lines, mortgages and investments would all lose their anchor. The collapse would not remain in markets. It would seep into kitchens, bedrooms and backyards. Imagine sitting in your home and watching someone appear across the table, not through the door, but through the very air. Families might continue to lock doors out of habit, but the gesture would feel meaningless. A child could vanish not into a car or alley, but into thin air. A prison could not contain its inmates. An airport could not secure its gates. A stadium, a subway, even a school would carry the same permanent dread. Anyone at any moment could simply arrive. The psychological toll would be staggering. Humans survive on boundaries. We rest because walls reassure us that what is outside will stay outside. We sleep because we believe the roof above will keep us safe. Remove those assumptions and rest itself collapses. Insomnia becomes epidemic. Paranoia turns from disorder into common sense. Dreams themselves would be haunted by the possibility that privacy is gone, that presence and absence are no longer under our control. Communities would fray not from bombs or invasions, but from exhaustion, suspicion, and sleeplessness. Think of the Cold War again. Already tense, already defined by suspicion, it would tilt into madness. Ambassadors in NATO halls would glance at each other, wondering if invisible fleets hovered unseen off their shores. Soviet generals would second-guess every blank patch of radar. fearing that silence itself was camouflage. The Cuban Missile Crisis would not even have unfolded, because staging weapons would be pointless. Why place missiles on an island if they could appear anywhere at once? The very concept of strategy would break, replaced by permanent brinkmanship, in which no one knew whether they were safe or already surrounded. The social unravelling would stretch further still. Art and ritual are built on journeys, pilgrimages are measured by endurance, stories are shaped by distance, songs of travel, novels of separation, entire metaphors of absence and return, all depend on space-resisting collapse. In a world where movement meant nothing, culture would hollow. Journeys would lose meaning because arrival would be effortless. Pilgrimages would no longer sanctify because the sacred could be reached without struggle. Even spiritual life would fracture, stripped of its slow pathways toward meaning. And what of technology itself? Roads, railways, and aircraft exist only because matter must move. If it no longer had to, then industry would rot. Jobs built around transport would vanish. Cities would not just lose value, they would lose purpose. Why live near work if any place is equally close? Why guard national borders when none can hold? This is the darker paradox of the Philadelphia experiment. If it truly brushed against teleportation, then the fused sailors and broken minds were not the accident. They were the warning. Perhaps the only reason society still resembles itself is because the field collapsed before it could be perfected. Perhaps failure saved us. The men trapped in bulkheads, the scrims from steel, the madness etched in rumour. These become not signs of a botched experiment, but the very shield that kept humanity from unleashing chaos on itself. And yet, the whispers refuse to fade. Even if the project was abandoned, its legend insists that fragments survived. Operation Paperclip scattered German notebooks into American vaults. Soviet officers carried their own trophies east. UFO sightings multiplied in the skies. Governments denied and redacted, then contradicted their denials with new explanations. For believers, this sequence is not coincidence. It is continuity. A destroyer shimmered in Philadelphia. A bell spun in Poland. Fragments travelled west in Manila folders. And then, in 1947, something else fell from the sky in New Mexico. The Eldridge's story ends in screams and failure, but the sky carried stranger lights. Only 4 years later, wreckage lay scattered across a ranch outside Roswell, metallic shards glinting under the desert sun. The Army first called it a flying disc. Then they reversed themselves, claiming a weather balloon. That abrupt denial sounded too practiced, too neat. And so, for those already haunted by whispers of vanishing ships, the link seemed clear. If teleportation was too destructive to pursue openly, perhaps it was folded into another narrative, one not of human invention, but of contact. The Eldridge's legend warned of walls collapsing and men broken by invisible forces. But Roswell's wreckage suggested something stranger, that maybe we were not the first to master such physics. The next question was unavoidable. What if Philadelphia was not an accident of war, but the first clumsy attempt to copy what had already come from the stars? Teleportation by itself is staggering, but the story doesn't stop there. Once the Philadelphia experiment was threaded into Cold War rumour, another current began to flow alongside it: UFOs. In 1947, just 4 years after the Eldridge supposedly blinked out of Philadelphia harbour, a rancher outside Roswell, New Mexico, discovered wreckage scattered across his land. Metallic shards, strange beams, even foil-like material that resisted bending. The Army first announced it had captured a flying disc, then quickly retracted, insisting it was only a weather balloon. That reversal felt too sharp, too rehearsed, and conspiracy culture locked onto it. And if distance could die for a ship, what if it had already died for something not built on Earth? The timing mattered. If a Navy destroyer had already flirted with killing distance, and then an unidentified craft scattered itself across a ranch, 2 years later, maybe the two weren't separate stories at all. To proponents, they formed a chain. The Eldridge was an attempt to mimic alien physics, and Roswell was the proof that such physics existed to be copied. What the Navy had stumbled toward clumsily in wartime, extraterrestrials had already mastered. From the start, the Philadelphia experiment was described with imagery that didn't sound like ordinary science. An electric halo, sudden disappearance, men welded where no flesh should be. These were not the expected side effects of electromagnetic coils. They sounded otherworldly. Roswell gave that imagery a framework. If alien craft had crashed, then the materials recovered could explain those effects. Strange alloys, anti-gravity systems, energy fields unlike anything in human labs. Suddenly the bizarre stories from Philadelphia felt less like drunken sailor tales and more like glimpses of technology borrowed from elsewhere. In fact, this is where conspiracy writing becomes most confident, because secrecy around UFOs has been acknowledged, even if the explanations remain contested. Government agencies did track sightings, they did collect reports, they did change their stories. The official narrative shifted repeatedly, from weather balloons to crash dummies, to classified surveillance balloons under Project Mogul. Each revision created more suspicion, not less. If officials kept changing the story, perhaps they were hiding something bigger. Here's where the Philadelphia experiment gains a new spine. Proponents suggest that what happened on the Eldridge wasn't entirely homegrown science. Instead, they argue, fragments of alien craft had already been captured, whether at Roswell or earlier incidents, and those fragments were handed to military researchers. Unable to replicate the whole, engineers experimented with pieces, applying them clumsily to naval vessels. Imagine placing a fragment of alien power source beside ordinary coils and amplifiers, hoping to force them together. The result might look exactly like the stories describe: blinding haze, bizarre effects, human bodies torn apart by forces no one understood. This thread runs deep through UFO culture. Again and again, you find the claim that humanity's strangest leaps forward, integrated circuits, fiber optics, stealth technology, arrived not from clean progress but from salvage science from a wreck not built here. Philadelphia becomes part of that narrative. It wasn't simply a Navy project, it was the first crude attempt to graft alien science onto human steel. Notice how the imagery overlaps. UFO witnesses often describe glowing fields, distortions of shape, or sudden disappearances. The Eldridge was said to shimmer, blur, and vanish. Sources were reported to tilt at impossible angles, defying gravity. The bell supposedly radiated light that sickened plants and people. These stories converge into a single vocabulary: strange glow, distorted form, collapse of ordinary physics. Whether the craft was a saucer, a bell, or a destroyer, the witnesses described the same haunting spectacle. For conspiracy writers, this repetition is not coincidence. It is consistency across different stages of contact. Aliens had mastered these fields. The Nazis had chased them. The Americans had stumbled onto them, and each left behind echoes, electric halos, radiation burns, twisted witnesses, proofs too scattered to form consensus, but too persistent to ignore. The US government did not ignore UFO reports. In 1948, the Air Force launched Project Sign, followed by Project Grudge, and eventually Project Blue Book, which ran until 1969. Thousands of sightings were catalogued, most explained away as weather, stars, or aircraft. But a small percentage remained unidentified. To the public, it looked like denial bound in binders. If the government was confident UFOs were harmless, why continue investigations for 2 decades? And within that climate, the Philadelphia experiment found new footing. Adherents argued that the Navy's silence was of the same cloth as the Air Force's. Both were engaged in concealment. Both fed the public half-truths. Both were motivated by fear that if the truth was admitted, alien craft, alien physics, the foundations of society would collapse. Decades later, the Philadelphia legend was rejoined to the UFO stream through the Montauk Project mythos. Camp Hero, a radar base on Long Island, was rumoured to house experiments in time tunnels and interdimensional contact. Central to these claims was the idea that alien technology had been integrated into radar arrays, producing gateways through which not only time but entities might pass. Albilec's Montauk claims, credible or not, stitched the shipyard myth to radar towers and something not entirely human. Whether his testimony holds weight doesn't matter for the story's endurance. It links the Philadelphia experiment to a longer arc, from Roswell wreckage to radar towers, from sources to shipyards, all leading to hidden programs testing contact with something not of Earth. In that sense, the Philadelphia experiment ceases to be a naval oddity. It becomes the first chapter in a saga of ongoing hybridization between alien physics and human ambition. Consider the fused sailors again. Mainstream analysis treats those stories as exaggerations, metaphors for radiation sickness or hallucination. But within UFO lore, they become evidence of alien technology mishandled. If you believe matter can phase in and out of dimensions aboard a saucer, then men half trapped in bulkheads are no longer symbolic. They are casualties of human bodies exposed to alien fields without proper containment. The screams from within steel become the mirror of abductees describing their bodies distorted on craft. Both sets of victims reflect the same reality. Our biology cannot endure what advanced physics demands. And this makes the Philadelphia experiment darker, not lighter. Because if the event was linked to alien fragments, it was never going to succeed safely. It was doomed from the start. A collision between technology meant for beings far beyond us and men with riveted ships and wartime urgency. There is also the idea that myths themselves serve as controlled leaks. The government may deny UFO contact in formal channels, but rumours of Philadelphia or Roswell allow fragments to slip into public awareness indirectly. A vanishing destroyer sounds like science fiction, and that implausibility provides cover. Blend a hard fact with a wild edge, and it travels everywhere, while proving nothing. The Philadelphia experiment then becomes not just an accident of rumour, but a chosen vessel for disclosure, seeding the public with concepts of teleportation, invisibility, and alien physics in a form easy to dismiss yet hard to forget. Another thread is simple persistence. UFO reports did not fade after Roswell. They grew. Kenneth Arnold's Flying Saucers in 1947, radar-confirmed events over Washington, D.C. in 1952, the Rendlesham Forest incident in 1980, the Phoenix Lights in 1997. Each added weight to the idea that something beyond conventional aircraft was intruding on human skies. For proponents, Philadelphia belongs on that timeline. The same forces behind those craft might have brushed against a Navy ship in 1943, leaving chaos in their wake. If the technology was alien, what motive lies behind its transfer, or crash? Some speculate it was deliberate, that extraterrestrials seeded fragments to accelerate our development, nudging us toward a future they had already mastered. Others argue the opposite, that crashes were accidents, and our theft of wreckage amounted to technological trespass. In that view, Philadelphia was not sanctioned discovery. It was reckless theft, a child gripping a live wire and calling it wonder. Either frame intensifies the horror. If the experiment was seeded intentionally, it suggests our suffering was foreseen, perhaps even necessary. If it was theft, then our tragedy was the price of hubris, an echo of myths where mortals stole fire from the gods. Either way, the fused sailors become symbols not of failure, but of humanity stepping into knowledge it was never prepared to bear. All of this circles back to the same chilling possibility. If alien technology lay behind the Philadelphia experiment, then the event wasn't isolated. It was part of a continuum of contact, secrecy, and misapplication. From sources to shipyards, from radar towers to time tunnels, the story grows not smaller but larger. And it pushes us toward an unsettling question. What would happen if such technology truly worked? Not in fragments, not in accidents, but in full. The answer doesn't remain in shipyards or air bases. It bleeds into cities, families, and daily routines. Because once you can bend space, it doesn't stay on the base. And that brings us to the most disturbing step of all. Forget fleets and generals for a moment. Imagine your own neighbourhood, your own kitchen, your own locked door. What happens when alien physics doesn't just stalk warships, but stalks you? And maybe that's where the story bends back on itself. Whether the forces came from alien wreckage, stolen notes, or reckless improvisation, the result was the same. Human beings caught inside fields their bodies could not survive. The Eldridge stops being only a symbol of possibility and becomes a symbol of restraint. Because if the technology belonged to others, it was never ours to wield. And if it truly was ours, then perhaps its collapse was the only thing that spared us. Which leads to the darker question believers circle again and again. Was humanity actually saved by the very failure it feared? Did humanity dodge its own destruction because the experiment backfired? That is the uncomfortable possibility that floats at the edge of the Philadelphia experiment legend. The story tells of teleportation, invisibility, and maybe even time travel. But it's wrapped in reports of sailors screaming from within steel walls and men collapsing as their minds tore apart. If there was truth in any of those accounts, maybe the reason we never saw fleets blinking across oceans is not that the technology failed, it's that it worked just enough to show how dangerous it was. Sometimes what looks like failure at first is actually survival by accident, the rough mercy of forces too unstable to be harnessed. Picture those few sailors again, bodies half swallowed by the bulkhead, or at least the rumours of them. Their nightmare becomes the allegory that keeps this myth alive. Progress can mutate into horror faster than humans can comprehend. In the conspiracies rhythm, those sailors were not just casualties of testing, they were the warning label. Their suffering, whether real or invented, plays the role of a cosmic stop sign. Continue down this road, the legend seems to say, and humanity would tear itself apart. The Navy didn't abandon teleportation because it couldn't work, but because it almost worked, and in doing so left human beings scarred beyond repair. It is easy to imagine the alternatives. If teleportation had been perfected, warfare would have transformed into chaos. Fleets would bypass defences, soldiers would appear inside cities without warning, and no government could maintain sovereignty. Civilian life would collapse under constant fear, as no door or distance could protect homes, families, or communities. The nightmare we imagined earlier, economies unravelling, families sleepless, societies choking on paranoia, would have been reality by the 1950s. Suddenly the atomic bomb wouldn't have been the only existential fear. We would have lived beneath a constant, invisible blade with no way to defend against it. That reality would not have lasted long without global collapse. If you believe that, then the real Philadelphia experiment wasn't the accident, it was the rejection. The story changes meaning when you frame it this way. Instead of another tale of government cover-ups and stolen futures, it becomes a myth of restraint, however unwilling that restraint might have been. The sailor's pain is still horrific, but in this narrative it prevents a wider tragedy. The experiment backfired, the rumours spread, and the project folded. Humanity carried on with more ordinary calamities, Cold Wars, proxy battles, nuclear standoffs, but never with the destabilising anarchy of teleportation on demand. The balance of the 20th century remained fragile but intact, because one ship supposedly demonstrated what happens when human ambition burns too hot. This isn't a comforting story. It's a cautionary one. Think about how often we chase technologies we only half understand. Advances arrive faster than our ethical frameworks can keep up with, and sometimes catastrophe slows us down before we can destroy ourselves. Nuclear meltdowns, chemical disasters, even computer viruses shaping modern conflict. They're all reminders that invention doesn't equal control. The Philadelphia experiment as a legend plays that role at a mythic scale. It says, you tried to order the fabric of reality, and you lost men into bulkheads instead. Step back, leave it alone, walk away while you still can. And if you think back over the narrative we've traced, it makes sense why this interpretation sticks. For every detail about Tesla's stolen notes, alien technology, or Nazi competition, there's always the human cost waiting in the shadows. Those stories of few sailors or men phasing in and out are not just horror embellishments, they're the mechanism that justifies abandonment. Even believers who want to celebrate hidden knowledge end up repeating those cautionary details. The pain is central to the myth, because it explains why the power, if discovered, was never unleashed. Humanity was saved not because brilliance failed, but because brilliance went too far, too fast. Ask yourself if that framing feels familiar. Myths often encode lessons about restraint, about why certain knowledge must remain forbidden. Ancient stories warned mortals not to steal fire from the gods or to glance back into forbidden realms. The Philadelphia experiment is built the same way, transposed into the language of electricity, coils, and green-blue light. It is a modern version of an ancient warning, teaching not through sermons but through a frightening narrative of science gone rogue. Sailors ruin their health instead of mythic heroes being cursed. But the structure is identical. You broke the rules of the universe, and you paid with lives. Perhaps that is why the Philadelphia experiment refuses to die, even when skeptics dismantle its evidence. It isn't the factual trail that gives it power, but the archetype beneath it. Progress paired with catastrophe, temptation answered by punishment, and salvation hidden inside disaster. Whether the Eldridge truly vanished or not, the story operates as a parable about limits. It whispers that some frontiers, when crossed, erase the world behind you. If you don't want everything to collapse, you must endure the failure and treat it as a warning. In that way, failure becomes the very thing that saves you. For once, failure might be humanity's shield. Not the shield of missiles protecting borders, not the shield of treaties holding back armies, but the shield of collapse halting us before we can ruin ourselves. If the Philadelphia experiment happened in any form, its disintegration into chaos would have taught officials and observers alike that invisibility was already too dangerous, and teleportation even more so. The fact that it didn't mature, that it faded into rumour instead of blossoming into policy, may be the best outcome we could have hoped for. So maybe the real story here isn't about technology lost to government vaults, or alien secrets suppressed from the public. Maybe the real story is that the world we have, the flawed, fragile, but still functioning world, is only possible because the experiment ended in horror. We avoided unspooling reality itself because sailors suffered enough to make continuation unthinkable. It's a brutal mercy, but a mercy nonetheless. The disaster may have been a gift, and that's the paradox of this legend. We imagine suppressed greatness, secret machines, and cover-ups of revolutionary science. Yet embedded in the nightmare is a quieter truth we rarely voice. Humanity might have been spared not by what officials gave us, but by what they withheld. The Philadelphia experiment becomes less a lost opportunity and more a lesson about fragile survival. And as you weigh that, it leads naturally to the final step. Not proof, not documents, but a reflection on why myths like this persist. They endure because they teach us what not to wish for. They reflect back our hunger for suppressed truths, but they also remind us of the dangers those truths might contain. In the end, the Philadelphia experiment doesn't shine as a tale of hidden triumph. It lingers as a warning that sometimes the worst outcome for an experiment is success. And from that perspective, failure wasn't tragedy. It was the one thing that kept us safe enough to live the history we recognise today. If the legend warns us what not to wish for, it also reveals something about us, the way fear, secrecy, and hope braid themselves into belief when proof refuses to stand still. The Philadelphia experiment isn't only a story about ships or sailors, it's also a story about psychology, about why we choose to believe the unbelievable, and why some myths refuse to die even when evidence is thin. In many ways, the endurance of this tale may tell us more about the human mind than about the Eldridge itself. Think about the years that frame this rumour. World War II had just ended, and with it came revelations of secret projects on a scale nobody outside classified circles had imagined. Entire cities were built in secret, their real purpose wrapped in cover stories. When the bombs fell on Japan, the public learned all at once that history's deadliest weapon had been hidden in plain sight until the moment of fire. That knowledge left a scar. If such a vast secret could be concealed, what else might be buried behind fences and files? Trust in official accounts began to erode. The Cold War deepened that fracture. Espionage, propaganda, surveillance, all became daily realities. Suspicion was no longer paranoia, it was survival. Against that backdrop, a rumour about a destroyer swallowed by electric haze sounded less like pulp fantasy, and more like an echo of something plausible. The public didn't need proof. They already knew their leaders had kept enormous secrets before. Why not again? Belief follows strange rules. The more outlandish a claim, the more likely it is to lodge in memory. If someone mutters that the Navy once tinkered with radar jamming, the detail fades. But if someone swears sailors were fused into steel bulkheads, screaming from within metal walls, that image never leaves you. Conspiracies thrive not because they are ordinary, but because they are extraordinary. Psychologists studying rumour argue that people pass along stories that resolve anxieties. In times of war, citizens feared hidden weapons, sudden technological leaps, and enemies with impossible advantages. A tale of teleportation fit perfectly. It took those anxieties and distilled them into one shocking narrative. And in a way, it offered comfort. Yes, the world was unstable, but here was a story that explained why. Something happened, even if officials denied it. Human memory is slippery, yet it rarely admits its slipperiness. Sailors recalling events years later may genuinely believe what they saw. A glow clinging to the ship's outline, instruments going haywire, a sudden disorientation. Trauma and exhaustion carve strange shapes into recollection. Psychologists call it a memory fill-in. The mind stitches fragments together with details that feel right, even if they're not verifiable. But here's the paradox. Inconsistency doesn't always weaken a rumour. Sometimes it strengthens it. If one sailor insists the ship vanished for 3 minutes, and another swears it was 3 hours, the contradiction doesn't end the tale, it deepens it. Believers conclude that something happened. Something so disruptive that memory itself couldn't hold steady. Confusion becomes evidence. The less tidy the recollections, the more convincing the trauma seems. In conspiracy logic, denial itself often counts as confirmation. If officials insist, this never happened, believers don't take that as closure. They treat it as proof that there's something to hide. Any clean explanation, weather balloons, training drills, misplaced logs, reads less like truth and more like an official walkback. That cycle is what psychologists call a closed loop. Any counter-evidence is reinterpreted as further support. The Philadelphia experiment thrives inside that loop. Naval logs show the Eldridge in Norfolk, not Philadelphia. To adherents, that means the logs were rewritten. Navy spokesmen deny teleportation. To true believers, that means the order to deny came from higher up. Evidence against the legend becomes the very fuel that keeps it alive. Then there is the deeper magnetism of forbidden knowledge. People are drawn to secrets precisely because they're hidden. When you hear about a classified experiment, your first impulse isn't dismissal, but curiosity. What's inside? Why can't I know? It's the same human impulse behind myths of sealed boxes, veils never lifted, or fire stolen from the gods. The Philadelphia experiment feels like one of those forbidden fires. Whether true or not, it whispers that humanity brushed against knowledge it was not meant to wield. That whisper makes it irresistible. Even skeptics return to it, not because they accept the details, but because they can't quite set aside the possibility that some ember of truth glows beneath the ash. Conviction is rarely solitary. People gather around shared suspicion, forming communities that amplify one another. In the 1950s, those networks took shape through letters and pulp magazines. By the 1980s, they grew through late-night radio, VHS documentaries, and eventually the internet. Each retelling of the Philadelphia experiment wasn't just about information. It was about belonging. Saying "I believe" becomes a door into a room full of people who share your mistrust. That kinship is powerful. A rumour about a vanishing ship turns into folklore, passed like a password from one believer to another. Doubt becomes community. And once a story provides identity as well as intrigue, it becomes nearly impossible to erase. Bring these threads together: suspicion, memory, denial, forbidden fire, community, and the Philadelphia experiment's endurance becomes clearer. If it had been disproved with absolute transparency, it might have faded. If it had been fully proven, it would have turned into history. But because it lived in the gap between proof and denial, it stayed alive. Conspiracy scholars call this cognitive resonance. A tale survives if it explains more than it contradicts. Philadelphia explains secrecy. It explains why sailors spoke of horrors and why officials stayed quiet. It explains Cold War paranoia and even dovetails with UFO accounts. Each retelling weaves in more threads, and the more threads it gathers, the harder it is to cut away. Here's the final twist. Belief itself becomes part of the legend. Whether or not the Eldridge vanished, the fact that millions wonder if it did is itself revealing. It shows how fragile public trust can be, and how swiftly communities will trade official history for whispered narrative when secrecy leaves gaps. The Philadelphia experiment acts like a mirror. For some, it reflects government overreach. For others, it reflects human ambition gone too far. For still others, it reflects alien intrusion. But whichever way you tilt the mirror, it shows the same face: our hunger to find meaning in mystery, even when evidence refuses to cooperate. If myths endure because they satisfy psychological hunger, then the Philadelphia experiment is not just a tale about steel and sailors. It's a parable about belief itself. You can measure coils, analyze ship logs, and still the story breathes, not because of what happened, but because of what people are willing to imagine, and that raises the final unease. If this story proves we will believe even the strangest rumours when secrecy surrounds them, what does that say about the next leak, the next fragment, the next half-heard whisper? How many of tomorrow's legends are already seeded in today's classified vaults, waiting for conviction to water them into permanence? And if secrecy keeps breeding tomorrow's legends, caution may be the only truth we can live with. So maybe the safest wisdom isn't about mastering new forces, but about respecting the ones we can't yet name. Some myths stay alive not because they offer proof, but because they warn us what not to desire. The Philadelphia experiment sits in that space between temptation and fear, whispering that certain doors should never be opened. Maybe the truly dangerous part isn't the image of a ship disappearing, but our hunger to push past limits without pausing to ask what the cost might be. Mystery can protect us as much as it unsettles us. Sometimes silence shields more than it hides. And maybe, in the end, the safest secret is the one science never manages to fully uncover.